All right, everyone, welcome back. We're ready to dive into another deep dive. And this time, we're going to tackle something that might sound a little, well, intimidating at first glance.
Intimidating. What are we talking about?
We're taking on production costs. Yep, straight out of chapter 11 of this economics textbook I found.
Yeah.
But don't worry, I promise it's going to be way more interesting than it sounds. We're going to break it down so it's actually useful, whether you're running a business or just curious about how the world works.
I agree. Production costs, they're the backbone of, well, pretty much every business decision out there. It affects everything, really, from how much those cool new sneakers cost to whether your favorite coffee shop stays open.
Exactly.
Mm,
So if you've ever wondered why prices go up or why some companies thrive while others struggle, well, understanding production costs can give you a whole new perspective. We're talking about the nuts and bolts of how businesses figure out what to produce, how much to produce, and ultimately how to, actually make a profit.
And don't worry, we're not going to get bogged down in all the technical jargon.
Yeah, we're going to make it clear, easy to understand, and hopefully even a little fun.
Right, because let's face it, economics doesn't always have the best reputation for being, well, the most exciting subject. But
Yeah.
trust us, once you start peeling back the layers and seeing how these concepts play out in the real world, it can be absolutely fascinating.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. In economics, they like to break things down into the short run and the long run. And when it comes to production costs, it's no different. So let's tackle the short run first.
Sounds good.
Now, in the short run, businesses have to deal with certain costs that are, well, fixed. They don't change no matter how much or how little they produce.
Yeah, think about it like this. You've got a factory, right? You're paying rent for that space, whether you're churning out 1,000 widgets a day or just 10.
Exactly. That rent is a fixed cost. It's a constant, like a loyal dog that's always there no matter what.
That's a great analogy, actually.
And then, of course, you've got your variable costs.
Ah, yes, variable costs. These are the costs that, well, they change depending on how much you're producing. So let's say you are making those widgets we talked about. The more widgets you make, the more raw materials you're going to need, right?
More steel, more plastic, maybe more tiny screws, whatever goes into making a widget. And those costs, they go up as your production ramps up.
Exactly. More output equals higher variable costs. It's a pretty straightforward relationship.
So to get your total cost in the short run, you just add those two up. Fixed costs plus variable costs.
Yeah.
It's like a simple recipe for figuring out your overall expenses.
It is. And for businesses, this short run view is really important for making day-to-day decisions, like how much should we produce today? Can we squeeze in another production run? These are the kinds of questions that understanding short run costs can help answer.
Okay, so we've got our total cost figured out, but now let's zoom in a bit. What about the cost of producing just one more unit? Like, we're already making 100. What's it going to cost to make number 101?
Ah, that's where we get to marginal cost.
Marginal cost, right?
Marginal cost is all about understanding how your total cost changes when you produce one more unit. It's a crucial concept because it helps businesses decide whether it's actually profitable to increase production. Sometimes making that extra unit can cost more than you'd make by selling it.
Yeah, so it's not always about making more, more, more. It's about finding that sweet spot where each additional unit is actually adding to your bottom line.
Precisely. And this is where things start to get really interesting from a business strategy perspective, because you've got to balance those marginal costs with something called average cost. And average cost is exactly what it sounds like. It's your total cost divided by the number of units you produced. So it tells you, on average, how much each unit costs to make.
Gotcha. So you need to keep an eye on both, right? Marginal cost to see if it's even worth making more, and average cost to see if you're in the right ballpark for pricing and profitability.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance, that efficiency. Businesses want to keep their average cost as low as possible while still making sure that producing more doesn't suddenly send their marginal costs skyrocketing.
Okay, so that's the short run. But what happens when businesses start thinking long term? Like when they're planning for expansion or maybe even changing their whole production process? That's where long run costs come in, right?
Right. The long run is where things get really exciting because now businesses have the flexibility to adjust pretty much everything. We're talking about potentially changing the size of their factory, investing in new technology, maybe even completely overhauling their supply chain.
So it's like they're not just tweaking the recipe anymore. They're thinking about a whole new kitchen.
Exactly. In the long run, it's all about finding the most efficient way to produce over time. And one of the key concepts here is something called the long run average cost, or LAC.
LAC. So that's basically like the average cost, but thinking way down the road, right?
Exactly. It's the lowest possible average cost per unit when a business has the time and flexibility to adjust all of its inputs. And this is where things get really interesting because sometimes getting bigger can actually lower your average costs. Think about buying in bulk, right? The more you buy, the lower the price per unit. Well, sometimes the same thing can happen with production.
So that's where the idea economies of scale comes in, right?
hmm
I always hear that term thrown around, but I'm not always sure what it really means.
It's a pretty simple idea at its core. Economies of scale happen when a company's average cost per unit goes down as it produces more. It's like they're getting more efficient as they grow. There are lots of reasons why this might happen, like maybe they can negotiate better deals with suppliers because they're buying in such large quantities, or maybe they can spread their fixed costs, like those, remember, like rent and equipment, over a much larger number of
Right.
units.
It's like that fixed cost is getting diluted as they make more and more stuff.
Exactly. And that can be a huge advantage for businesses, especially in industries where size really matters. Think about companies like Amazon or Walmart. They've built these massive, incredibly efficient logistics networks that allow them to offer incredibly low prices because they're moving huge volumes of goods.
That makes sense, but I guess it can't always be about getting bigger and bigger, right? There must be a point where, I don't know, it becomes too much.
You're absolutely right. Bigger isn't always better. And that's where we get to the flip side of economies of scale, which is something called diseconomies of scale.
Just economies of scale. So it's basically like growing pains for businesses.
Exactly. It's what happens when a company grows too big, too fast, or maybe just becomes too complex to manage effectively. You can start to see things like communication breakdowns, inefficiencies creeping in, and suddenly those average costs that were going down start to climb back up.
Oh, so it's like they're tripping over their own feet as they try to grow.
That's a great way to put it. Think about a company that expands too quickly into new markets or product lines without really having the systems in place to manage that growth. They might end up with a bloated bureaucracy, slow decision making, and ultimately higher costs.
So finding that balance is key. It's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. But instead of porridge, it's the size of your business. You want it to be just right, not too big, not too small.
Precisely. And that's where things get even more complex because businesses don't just have to worry about how much to produce, they also have to figure out the best combination of resources to use. Do they hire more workers? Do they invest in more machines? How do they find that perfect mix of inputs to minimize their costs and maximize their output?
Right. Because every business has different resources available, different needs, and different goals. There's no one-size-fits-all answer here.
Exactly. And that's where economics provides some really cool tools to help businesses navigate these decisions. One of these tools is something called an ISA-cost line.
ISA-cost line? That sounds a little, technical.
Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Basically, an ISA-cost line is a visual representation of different combinations of inputs, like labor and capital, that all cost the same. So you can think of it like a budget line for a business. They have a certain amount of money to spend, and the ISA-cost line shows them all the different ways they could allocate that money to different inputs.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So it's like having a shopping list for your business, but instead of groceries, you're choosing between workers and machines.
That's a great analogy. And then to figure out the best possible combination of inputs, we bring in another tool called an ISAQuant.
An ISA-quant. All right, you're losing me again.
Stay with me. An ISAQuant is basically a curve that shows you all the different combinations of inputs that can produce the same level of output. So you can think of it like a map of all the different paths you could take to reach the same destination, which in this case is your desired production level.
Okay, so the ISA-cost line shows you all the different ways you could spend your money, and the ISAQuant shows you all of the different ways you could reach your production goal. But how do those two things help a business make a decision?
That's the best part. To find the optimal input mix, businesses look for the point where the ISA cost line just touches the highest possible ISAQuant. It's like finding that sweet spot where you're getting the most bang for your buck, maximizing your output while staying within your budget.
Wow, so it's like a puzzle where you're trying to fit those two pieces together perfectly.
Exactly. And by using these tools, businesses can figure out whether they should hire more workers, invest in more automation, or maybe even find a completely different balance between those two. It all depends on their specific circumstances, their industry, and of course, their goals.
Wow, so we've really gone from the basics of fixed and variable costs all the way to these visual tools that help businesses make complex decisions about their inputs and their production levels. It's amazing how all these concepts connect.
It is. But here's a final thought to leave our listeners with. Everything we've talked about today is just the starting point. The real world is messy, it's unpredictable, and things are constantly changing.
Right, like what happens when a pandemic hits, or a war breaks out, or a new technology comes along that completely disrupts the game? How do businesses adapt these cost calculations to those kinds of situations?
Exactly. Those are the kinds of questions that keep economists up at night, and honestly, there's no easy answer. But that's what makes it so fascinating, because understanding the principles of production costs gives you a framework for thinking about these challenges, for analyzing the trade-offs, and ultimately, for making better decisions in a world that's constantly throwing you curveballs.
Well said. So there you have it, folks. A crash course in production costs, from the short run to the long run, from basic concepts to visual tools. We hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the complexity and the importance of these ideas, not just for businesses, but for all of us as consumers and as participants in the global economy.
And who knows, maybe you'll even start seeing isocost lines and isoquants in your dreams?
Sweet dreams, everybody.